How to effectively listen to somebody's voice. Today we take a masterclass exploring the 3 levels of how to listen effectively, thoroughly, and practically to the speaker's voice. Deep listening, impact beyond words. G'day, I'm Oscar Trimboli, and this is the Apple Award-winning podcast, Deep Listening, designed to move you from a distracted listener to a deep and impactful leader. Did you know you spend 55% of your day listening, yet only 2% of people have ever been taught how? In each episode, we explore the 5 levels of listening. Communication is 50% speaking and 50% listening. Yet as a leader, you're taught only the importance of communication from the perspective of how to speak. It's critical you start to build some muscles for the next phase in how to listen. The cost of not listening? It's confusion, it's conflict, it's projects running over schedule, it's lost customers, it's great employees that leave before they want to. When you implement the strategies, the tips and tactics that you'll hear, you'll get 4 hours a week back in your schedule. I wonder what you could do with an extra 4 hours a week. Today's masterclass is all about listening to someone's voice. If you've taken the listening quiz and you're either the interrupting listener or the lost listener, today's discussion is all about how to listen to the range in the speaker's voice. It will help you understand when you feel the urge to interrupt. Just take a moment longer to listen to where the speaker's voice is coming from in their body. Perhaps you've read about him in the Washington Post, or you've heard him speak on radio, and if not, you might have seen Eric Arceneaux's YouTube, where his viral singing techniques and videos have generated over 30 million views. Eric's a world-renowned vocal coach and a breathwork expert and a recording artist. Eric has developed a reputation for transforming and saving voices. Whether you need to prepare for a musical or the FIFA Football World Cup, singing professionals call Eric to help them reach their full vocal and singing potential. What I love about this interview is the range and nuance Eric has for explaining how the voice is created by humans. Let's listen to Eric. What do you think the cost of not listening to someone is?
I have a student who stutters really badly, and we were discussing how a big part of his therapy has not been vocal exercises per se, or even breathing techniques. I mean, that is a part of it, but just conversing with him and making sure that he had enough time to feel safe and knowing that he was being listened to. Because quite often, and this can't be said across the board, but quite often certain vocal issues erupt from people growing up in environments where they weren't given a voice or a chance to be heard. And so they begin to develop anxiety and they become quite frantic in their attempts to communicate because they felt like they've never been listened to. And quite often, when you feel like you don't have a voice, figuratively speaking, you can lose your voice literally. And so there are issues like psychogenic dysphonia where people truly cannot speak, or they're speaking as if through a vice. And there's nothing physically, visibly wrong, but often it's from feeling like they haven't been listened to. So there are a myriad of vocal issues that result from people not being listened to.
What role your parents or your grandparents played in influencing how you listen?
I grew up in New Orleans in true Southern culture, where children are seen and not heard, and you're not allowed to have a voice because you're not a person yet. And so you're a child and you're not allowed to have thoughts. And I think that I was really lucky. My mother was a school teacher and my father was a minister, but also a teacher. And I think they really made me feel like I was intelligent and like I had a right to my thoughts and my opinions. And unlike a lot of my friends, I felt like I was listened to, and I was able to converse with my parents in a way that was not common, especially from my culture. And I just mean really Southern culture in general. My parents would just talk to me. There would be discourse, and they would speak to me as if I was an actual person and not just a child.
Can you zoom us into a time where you remember maybe a situation or a story where that did have an impact for you when your parents were listening to you as a person rather than a child?
I've never spoken about this publicly before, but when I first began taking voice lessons, my first teacher, he didn't actually do anything specific to me, but I just did not feel, I guess, intuitively, I didn't feel entirely comfortable with him, even though he was very knowledgeable, but I just felt uneasy. And I remember voicing that to my father and him saying, if he ever does, like, if you can decide right now, do you want to continue working with him or do you want to stop? Well, I was like maybe 13, 14 years old. I really felt empowered to speak up for myself because he could be a little rude at times. And I was taught to respect authority and respect teachers, but I really felt able to speak up for myself. Eventually, I stopped working with him. And it turned out that he was, in fact, a pedophile and he was preying on some of his students. I know I was really lucky and but I think that part of what, not that any victim deserves it, but I think part of what made him feel like he could not approach me in that way was that I was given a voice. And so I was not some helpless child where they were going to believe him above all else because that's an adult and you're a kid. There's a shift in the energy that I think people can sense when you're given that space. I was protected by the fact that I was given that liberty, and I knew my parents would believe me because I've heard horror stories of some of the kids who were his students. The parents just, oh no, not Irvin. Of course not, but he's such a stand-up guy and he's so educated and he's got kids of his own and he would never. They didn't do that to me, thankfully. I've never spoken about it, and thankfully nothing ever happened to me directly, which is good, but it was validating to be heard when I spoke to my parents about how I felt. And also when the news story broke, it was national news at the time because the guy, he fled to California. It was like, okay, I'm not crazy. And also I felt like I had the right to defend myself. And again, I think part of why it's so important to me is because one thing I heard was other kids around my age who weren't believed. And, and so they weren't listened to.
Eric, a lot of people I work with struggle with how to listen for somebody's voice. I'll be honest with you, they get quite frustrated with me because they go, you can hear things in people's voices that I can't hear. I can hear emotion where they can't. I can hear the voice is coming from a very different place in their physical body. I can hear the story is coming from a different place. But today we're here to listen to how you listen. When you see a client for the first time, how do you listen to them and what are you listening for?
I listen for internal space or lack thereof. You can hear when someone's very restricted and tight, and you can hear that. And sometimes it's mentally imposed and sometimes it's physical because they don't know how to properly facilitate getting their voice out there. So I'm always listening for space, and I'm also listening for body connection. People can be disconnected from their body. And what I specifically mean is when we speak, our voice should elicit responses from the body. Your abdomen should move. If you're speaking very forcefully, if you see an old friend from high school and you go, hey, your back muscles and your solar plexus should move. And if you are cut off from these connections, the voice is at risk of injury.
Is it a deliberate choice for you today to be standing up while we're speaking compared to Oscar's choosing to sit down? What happens to the voice while you're standing up versus while you're seated?
Okay, I actually am seated. I'm just very upright, but I do not sit on any chair with the back on it, especially if I'm using my voice deliberately. I'm not an anti-sitting voice teacher. As long as you sit well, I don't have a problem with it, with the student being seated. But actually, I'm in my workout room right now for the sake of acoustics. But in my office, I have a standing desk, and I do typically stand for most of the time. And that's because even though your vocal cords are in your throat, a lot of our breath control mechanisms and the energy to put out sound safely are in the pelvis and in the core and in the rib cage. And even we can derive a connection from the feet and from the glutes. And it sounds really ridiculous if you've never heard such a thing. But when you experience it, you go, oh, I didn't realize that I had so much more connection. What I really try to get across to people is that, yes, your vocal cords are of critical importance, obviously, but the vocal instrument is your body.
Step us through the process of creating a sound that is your voice. Where does it start and where does it finish?
You've mentioned breathing a few times, and it's kind of my obsession. It's one of those things that people take for granted because you can do it really poorly and still survive. You don't have to know how to breathe well in order to live. Our bodies can really do things at subpar capacity, and we can still live relatively long lives. Most people think, hey, I know how to breathe. I've been doing it, since I got out of the womb. And that's true. But the method I teach, to put it succinctly, I often say there are really only two steps, and that is to open up the body and then to try to retain that openness as we speak or as we sing. And the more dynamically you're using your voice, the more athletic this process becomes. So casual speaking is a bit different than singing an operatic aria or singing a rock song or something. But it does begin with the intake of air. And one of the first things we try to do, in fact, I prefer to teach this while seated, is to get people to feel a connection to their pelvic floor. Because even though your diaphragm is relatively higher, you always hear diaphragm from voice teachers, but your pelvic floor really anchors the diaphragm and helps the diaphragm to move more freely. And so when you're breathing, you can almost feel, it's so funny to say out loud, but you can almost feel a sense of your buttocks expanding against your seat. And that is a good sign that your pelvic floor is engaging. And then you will feel your chest swell and your rib cage open. What I really try to get my students to connect to is a full bodied breath. And in the beginning, at least from the pelvis, which we will say the glutes for now, up to the clavicles, and to feel like we're reaching down, but the body opens up. Sometimes we call this growing the tree, because as the roots go down, the body lifts up and opens up, because a tree doesn't grow from the top down. Those roots dig into the soil. And what I love is, growing up in New Orleans, we have these really old trees where the roots are so strong that they crack the concrete around them. And as the roots go down deeper, the tree grows up stronger. And I think of that imagery for myself. I drive the breath down toward my pelvis, towards my glutes, towards the tops of my thighs, and my spine lengthens and my rib cage opens. And it's really powerful. You get a very different sound when you do that, as opposed to like a very high, collarbone focused kind of breath that people typically resort to, especially if they're nervous, which is normal for public speaking or singing. So to get someone to root, we call it rooting, to root into the pelvis and to feel how everything else opens in response is very powerful. One of my favorite singers, Dame Joan Sutherland, who's Australian, she talks about this, about how, when I take a breath, I really think of it from the tops of my thighs, really. And she would say, it sounds like nonsense, but she would get this incredible virtual, her voice was ridiculous. People have been talking about this for thousands of years. I tell people, no matter who you are, you had ancestors who knew this. On every continent, there were people who knew this. You could look at yogic text or martial arts or African rituals. They talk about this stuff, whether to heal or to commune with spirits or to sing. I'm just kind of a curator of time-tested wisdom. Eric's
a big fan of James Nestor's work around breath. In episode 74, we discuss unlocking the ancient secrets between listening and breathing. There are many parallels between what James taught in the episode and what Eric is saying and reinforcing during this discussion.
We know that certain forms of breathing, specifically mouth breathing, can upset that balance of oxygen in the prefrontal cortex. So mouth breathing has been associated with ADHD. You're breathing in your fuel and your energy, and if you're doing it incorrectly and you don't have energy to really feed all these different neuronal pathways and to feed your body in the proper way, things are going to malfunction. When you're really focusing on your breath, that's what you're doing. You're listening to your body. I don't see a huge disconnect between listening and breathing, because you are very closely tuning in to exactly how you're feeling.
How does sound form and how does it get out?
The average person thinks that singing works like this, where you take a big breath and then you whoosh it out as hard as you can. You push it out, and that's how power is done. So they'll, and their throats will get really tight. And that's because when we make sound, your brain sends the electrical impulses to your vocal cords to vibrate. But your vocal folds, which is like the medical term, vocal cords, they're very small and very easily overwhelmed if too much breath comes at them at once. If you take a big breath and your body opens up, if you immediately collapse, your throat is going to be overwhelmed and it tightens up in response. Your body doesn't necessarily know that you're trying to sing. It just knows that it's kind of being assaulted a bit. And so the easiest concept to know, but it gets a little tricky to learn how to do, is to open up and take a breath. And then to retain this space as we make sound, and to maintain this openness. This is what everyone from Aretha Franklin to Joan Sutherland to a really good Shakespearean actor, I've learned that most people go to great lengths to not be present in their bodies. And so they're constantly trying to escape. And so I'm often giving people a tour of the vessel in which they live. And I even have a student, she's a medical illustrator. So she literally draws the pictures and paints the pictures for like textbooks and stuff that people at medical school look at. And she would tell me all the time, she would say, Eric, I know what these muscles are. I know better than most. I know what they look like. I know where they're located. I've never felt them before. So this is my first time feeling them. So when we take a breath, we want to stay open by feeling muscles in our back and muscles around our solar plexus kind of firm up, and they help us to stay open. And then your vocal cords can draw the breath that they need as they need it, depending on the sound. Your body is extremely intelligent. We just have to afford the body space, because your diaphragm lives in your rib cage, your vocal folds live in your throat. If there's just enough space, they really do respond to your desire to communicate. The problem is when we collapse in the body and collapse in the throat, we smush them, and they're so encumbered they can't function properly to obey our mental commands or our desire to communicate.
Eric, I'm fascinated because you get the opportunity to listen to people sing, and you get to listen to people tell you a story about how they sing as well. And I think sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our voice is very different to what our voice is actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I can hear the trembling of emotion in somebody's voice. They can't even hear themselves, but it's only when they tell me the story.
I had a student who was a prominent attorney. She was the first female partner of her law firm, and she was very smart, very confident, a very strong presence if you were to meet her. But she was terrified of singing, and she just wanted to sing. And she prefaced, before I heard her sing a note, she told me that she knew she had this horrible voice and that I would really have my work cut out for me. And I was preparing myself for this. And and it's funny because it was like, okay, Eric, I sound so awful. I sound awful. I dreamed a dream in time gone by when hopes were high and life worth living. And I was really caught off guard because it was quite melodious. And and I was like, wait, I was expecting this really harsh. And she told me, so she wouldn't believe me when I told her that she sounded good, and she sounded better than that. That's my impersonation. But there was so much beauty in her voice. And she told me, and she was in her 40s. She told me that when she was 8 years old, she was singing happy birthday at a friend's birthday party. And one of the parents leaned over and said, "Hon, you really shouldn't sing along with the rest of us." And that was it. And that stayed with her for the rest of her life until that moment. And it's just interesting how powerful that is. And when people, and so for her whole life, she had this idea, I have this ugly, garish, harsh voice. And nothing could be further from the truth. It wasn't like that at all. She sounded like she could be a Broadway star or a West End star. It was insane to me. I have another student who was a principal at a school in Washington, D.C. at the Seed School. She was a student at a Catholic school, and the nuns would get so frustrated with her in chorus class that they would have her put her ear on the piano and bang notes. But again, afraid to sing, thinking her voice was ugly. And when I heard her, her voice was just as beautiful as a voice could be. So it's really interesting how people have these barriers. But the biggest thing I see is people obsessed with making their voice sound pretty. So it's like, like I'll get a guy who will do what I call boy band voice, and he'll do, when your legs don't work like they used to before. It's a common thing for everyone, where they'll send a lot of breath through the voice because they think that it kind of makes it more palatable or something. And so, and they're afraid to have their voice be solid when your legs don't work like they used to before. They're afraid that they can't do that. What I'm trying to get at is that there's kind of a sonic thumbprint to our voices. And a lot of people go to great lengths to avoid letting the uniqueness of their voice show. And so they think it's got to sound a certain way, usually based on the cultural norms. But throughout the UK, the US, Canada, whatever, it's pretty much the same, where they try to go for the same sounds. And it's just this, like, they want to be free, and they really covet people who can really be vulnerable and authentic with their voices, but they're deathly afraid of doing so themselves. And so they'll try to veil their voices. And you see that a lot, but it's because of the stories they've told that specialness is something that other people get to have, but I'm not special. So I have to try to cover up what I have. I have to code it. I have to filter it, because that's something that, Oscar gets to have, but not me.
I'm curious what or how you're listening for voice when connection is present and when connection is absent. So talk us through what you're listening for connection in the body and disconnection in the body.
This is subjective. It sounds like it's a quality of sound in which it sounds like someone's voice is being pulled at. So it's a really pulled, kind of pressurized sound. And you can hear that they're trying to get it out. Often I call this some people are in a perpetual state of apology for their existence. So it's almost like, I really hope you will listen to what I'm saying. I'm sorry that you have to listen. I'm sorry for putting you through this. And you'll notice that their chest will cave in. They'll crease at the sternum. Their shoulders will shrink. Some people think that this is what being humble is. And they think that, oh, I'm sorry for existing. They're afraid to take up physical space and kind of air space, or, sonic space. And you can hear this kind of pull, as opposed to if we gradually start to let the body open up, the voice becomes rounder. So I listen to tonal shapes a lot. And so now I feel like my voice takes up more space. You can hear a top and a bottom to my voice. There's a fullness, as opposed to this kind of squeeze. A lot of times people who grew up in situations where they had overbearing parents, maybe like a father who was physically present but emotionally distant. I don't want to be like him, so I'm going to speak like this, and it's the I come in peace kind of thing. So I'm going to shrink myself because I don't want any kind of authority. I don't want to be seen as authoritative. I don't want to be seen as menacing. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I don't want to be that. And so they kind of forfeit all of their power, and they end up kind of strangling themselves. Often women in corporate America will lower their voices tremendously. And studies show that it actually works, but it's unhealthy. But because we live in such a kind of a patriarchal system, to have a voice that's light and feminine is seen as weak. If they force their voice down low, they're seen as more capable of leadership, stronger. And so you'll hear that kind of forced push again. I can give you this example. If I was hearing, you are sunlight and I moon, joined by the gods of fortune. A lot of times people will say, oh, well, he just can't sing. He just doesn't have it. Just give up. Just why even bother? But it's not that the voice is not there. It's just buried underneath loads of tension. So if we open up and stay open, you are sunlight and I moon, joined by the gods of fortune. Same instrument, just used more efficiently. If we just keep open, and it actually irritates me because people are so dismissive, especially of people who are too young to know to fight back sometimes. So they'll say, oh, you just don't have it. Just give up. Singing is not for you. And I've learned that people really do hold on to it through their 40s, 50s, 60s, if they can, and the rest of their lives. And it's just a matter of opening up the body. But it sounds smushed. It sounds forced. It's stuff we hear all the time, but we often just say, oh, that's just her voice. That's just his voice. Or he doesn't sing well. And we just kind of dismiss it as that. But barring an actual injury, everybody is capable of having a resonant, full-bodied voice. It doesn't mean you have to pursue fame, but everyone can at least have a pleasant sound. Because what we think is pleasant as human beings, whether I have my students I have students in India, Iranian, we love to hear a voice that's free. We like to hear that a voice has agility and also resonance. We love to hear that freedom regardless of even our culture. I think it's really ingrained in us in humans. But when you hear that sense of smush, or like they're pushing to get the voice out, or when the voice is really breathy, no one's voice is naturally that way. They might be very used to it. The healthy default for any of us is a clear, full-bodied sound.
Can you take us on a guided tour of tonal shapes?
Usually in university, you learn a rounded shape. A classical. Very rounded, very legit kind of sound. I dreamed the dream in time gone by. That kind of sound. And then we have a more compressed shape. So we have rounded shape, then we have a more, what I think of as more of kind of a maybe rectangular, but like very compressed, that we would have in pop music. I just want to know your name and maybe sometime. And it's very kind of a focused speaking voice, and it's very kind of typical of pop music. And we also have kind of a curved sound, like what we call twang. And that's what it's in soul music and rock music, but that's in a, what you, baby, I got it. It's, it was known as the witch's voice, or the French, you hear it in like a Celine Dion kind of sound, or an Aretha Franklin. But rock singers like a Steven Tyler, that, they use that too. And I'm trying to pull back a little bit to not overload this mic, but it creates. But these are like the most common shapes, and of course there are infinite gradients in between. But rounded, this is kind of what I work with people, especially my Broadway clients, every day, helping them to develop their rounded shape. If they're doing like Les Mis or Porgy and Bess, Bess, you is my woman now, you is very rounded, versus something like wicked, which would be more compressed and speech-like. Maybe I'm brainless, maybe I'm wise. And then you have like the really rocker, soulful, got kind of gospel-y sound. And so like rounded, compressed, and then kind of twanged, or I think of like a curved thing. But of course, in science, they would use the term formants, and they literally measure like frequencies. But as a coach, you don't have a spectrometer there and all this machinery. So you have to kind of figure out your own mnemonic devices to kind of, and your own connections on how to hear these. So part of what I have to do for myself and for the teachers who work for me, who teach my method, I have to teach them how to listen for these things without the aid of like $100,000 machinery.
We've talked about the sounds people make, but often it's the absence of sound and silence that can be just as instructive. How do you listen for silence?
I'm always telling my students to sing the silence, to use the silence. I think especially when singing a cappella, a lot of singers, because singers are just people, are deathly afraid of silence. They feel like they have to fill in every gap, and it's very amateurish. So there's I'm trying, I'm dying. It's a Broadway thing. But then there's I'm trying, I'm dying. Why won't you let me in? And you can use the silence to convey emotion. And it's important. And like, it's such a simple concept to understand, like academically, but there's something I think that's very terrifying to singers about letting there be moments of silence and having to just be there kind of naked in those moments. But it's really important, or even to let your breath, make these sounds, which is not silence exactly.
Does silence have shapes?
I think it does. I think there is like attention-filled silence. And I think that there is very relaxed silence as well. I think that it's what shape it takes is kind of in the context of what comes before and after it, and kind of the energy that the person brings to it. I think this is really helped by things like body shape, and it helps if you can see the person as well. Definitely. I think it's contextual, but I do think that silence has shape. And what's interesting is even in classical music, I was an opera singer for like 2 years before I realized I didn't want that life. But composers are very explicit about the importance of rest. They don't just say take a break, but they're very specific about whether it's several measures or whether it's 2 beats or whether you stop abruptly or whether you kind of taper off. It does matter. Even how you arrive to the silence even matters. And also how you exit the silence. So there's like this, what's known as a coup de glace, like a immediate, like abrupt start of tone. And then there's also aspirato, where you kind of aspirate, like exhale into it versus, jumping right into it. And so I think there's almost something like, I don't know, this is where it does feel a bit magical, a little woo-woo. It's kind of your intention. You kind of radiate what the silence is. And a really good artist has that power. I remember taking conducting class when I was in college and being really irritated with my professor because he mentioned like intention as something he was grading me on. I was like, how can you grade my intention? Like, you can't possibly know that. But he was saying that you kind of have to will the orchestra. It's something that you can exude. And he was right. And it's hard to put into words because it's something you kind of feel, because we would practice with actual orchestral students. And you could tell the people who had like the strong command and the orchestra felt very like secure, and that there was this kind of almost telepathic communication going on. And then the people who were very deliberate in their movements, but they just didn't have that same, something was missing like that in that energy. There is loud silence.
Can we just touch on the things I should be listening for when you're teaching me as an instructor?
The 3 steps, or our 3 tiers, are breathing, our reflexes, and the vocal cords themselves. The 3 tiers, we look at it like a pyramid, where the biggest, fattest base of that is the breath. The first thing we work on is helping people to breathe with their full body. A big part of this is sonic. You can hear if someone's tight, that kind of thing. You would take them through a basic scale. And this is a good example. So the average guy is going to do this. If I go dung, 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 dung on my piano or whatever, they're going to go, they're going to bash it or some form of that. It's the most common thing. But if they take a good breath, you're going to hear a noticeable difference. It's going to sound more solid and more supported is a word that's used a lot with singers, but it sounds more stable. And then we have our reflexive responses. That's our second tier. And that's when you speak, can you feel your body respond? And some really good examples of this that are very natural. When you laugh, a little psychopathic there, laughing out of nowhere. But when you laugh, you feel your body respond. If you cough, which means something a little different right now, but if you cough, you feel your body move, especially your solar plexus, your abdomen. It's these natural responses you have. If you're really speaking up for yourself, particularly when you're setting a boundary, when you're saying, hey, I don't like that. No, your body will respond. These are things people don't really pay attention to, but I have to, like you said, with listening, it's kind of like the indigenous peoples in Alaska have all these different names for snow. But for us, we don't notice these nuanced differences. It's just snow to me. But I understand what it's like to be able to see nuance where other people just see this homogenous, like, but I'm just making sound. Trills are really interesting because they're probably the most ubiquitous vocal exercise in existence, at least in the Western world, if not the world. It seems like such a childish thing, and it's because we do it when we're toddlers and we're like kind of cooing and making these sounds. But when you make this sound through your like oscillating lips, you're creating resistance at the mouth. So instead of everything escaping at once, it's resistance training, but for your muscles, and you can kind of work through. I even have my public speakers, I have news anchors and whatever who I work with. If they're going to say, good morning, my name is Eric Arceneaux, and I'm here with Channel 5 News, there is flow and cadence and intonation with that. So I would have them go and work through it like that to feel that. But your reflexes, that's kind of your safety net. These should work anytime you're making sound. But then we have your vocal cords, which is our top tier. We learn how to really feel our chords closing to make sound and trying to refine that. You actually have really good chord closure, not to make you self-conscious about that, but you have a very crisp, the default setting of a speaking voice should be crisp and clean with what we call edge, to where there's not a lot of airiness or huskiness, or, it shouldn't be like this. This would be antithetical to what we're trying to achieve, but there should be some core to it. And so we might do like a ha 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 ha, just to help people feel ha 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 ha. How the chords kind of tap together to find that. And of course, there's a billion exercises, but it means the difference between I dreamed a dream and I dreamed a dream, where the chords can really close. And so we kind of learn to find a refined, efficient closing of the chords. And the very last part is learning how to actively open the body, which is quite advanced, but it's particularly important for getting the more dramatically powerful sounds. Is where you learn how to consciously use muscles in your body and to make them work to kind of reinforce the space so that you can make really dramatic sounds that make you think someone would damage their voice, but let you like do really crazy rock screams or really big opera sounds or Broadway belts or something.
Just like James Nestor exploring breathing, Eric Arceneaux understands how you can bring your true voice to every conversation and performance. More importantly, Eric can explain it in a way that's easy for all of us to access and understand how our voice works and when it doesn't and what gets in the way. What are you taking away and what are you applying from today's episode? I'd really like to know. send an email to podcast@oscartrimboli.com. That's podcast@oscartrimboli.com. I love receiving your perspective on each episode. It helps me to know what's useful for you so I can be doing more of it, and also what's not useful for you so we can pare that back and do as little as possible. Today, I'd especially love to hear from the interrupting or the lost listeners. If you've done the listening quiz at listeningquiz.com and you're interrupting or lost as your primary or secondary villain, I'm curious what techniques you're going to apply from today. Taking the time to listen beyond the sounds and the words and how they are formed in the vocal cords of the speaker will create a really different way for you to listen. Not just for the interrupting and lost listeners, but for all the listening villains out there. For me, what I'm taking away isn't about how I'll listen differently, rather how I speak and my vocal range. Something Eric tells me a little bit more about in the debrief. We'll be playing that at the end of the episode, where we explore my vocal range and what that means when I'm communicating. I'm noticing that my vocal range might be constrained sometimes and not opened up to its full potential. I'm noticing right now in which situations and relationships am I using my full range, and when am I hiding? When am I hiding myself in a really narrow, constricted? I'm noticing the difference in my range when I'm speaking with someone on the phone versus speaking with someone on the video conference. I wonder if you're noticing your vocal range at the moment. I want to say a big thank you to a few people who've taken the time to review the podcast. I'm really grateful for that because it helps me know what I'm doing well and how I can support you better. As I was speaking to a few people recently, it's a bit hard to visualize who's out there listening when I'm in my office staring into the microphone while I'm imagining who's out there. So a big thank you to Maurizio from Italy. He says, thanks for making a very useful tool available to this community. Thanks to David, who says, in my opinion, anyone who listens to this podcast will find it beneficial. Oscar and his team do an amazing job. Thank you for all the hard work. Thank you, David. This review of the podcast is from the United States and it's got a nickname. The nickname is Baby. Yeah. Great skills in this podcast. I love listening and being introduced to the unique professionals and their skill sets around deep listening. As an extrovert, I love meeting, understanding, and helping people. Ironically, as an extrovert, I talk too much instead of really hearing others and really being effective in helping them. After listening to several of the episodes on this podcast, I'm really seeing a difference in my ability to help others to be heard and to be helped. Thank you, Baby Yi. Great insights there and a lovely difference of looking at the world through the eyes of an extrovert. Baby Yi, I wonder what listening villain you are. I'd love to find out. Send me an email at podcast@oscartrimboli.com, podcast@oscartrimboli.com, and email me if you've got any questions about listening. We are about to create a regular episode called Ask Me Anything. In this Ask Me Anything episode, I'll be answering questions like these that have come from a range of people recently. Tracy asks, my biggest issue is I feel like I'm always distracted or rushed. I'm trying to multitask and therefore I'm not fully present when it comes to my listening. This message from California in the United States, and ironically, their name is Sydney. I hope this message finds you well. As a listener, I'm struggling to stay focused and out of my own thoughts. I'm a lost and a dramatic listener and desperately need to fix it. I'm finding it harder than ever to stay focused on what I want to do and what I think about sometimes. Thanks, Sydney. Gary from the United Kingdom asks, I'm an avid podcast listener, so my question is, where do I start from your wealth of guidance? Should I, and he puts in brackets, For example, start with the latest podcast you've released, or simply pick up the podcast from the point of discovery. Or are there really powerful ones that you would suggest I listen to first? I'm really looking forward to going on this journey. And yes, Oscar, don't worry, I've already joined the 90-day challenge. Thank you, Gary. Should we rate our most favorite podcast? Send me an email, podcast@oscartrimboli.com. Which would be the podcast you would recommend to Gary? Would it be the 5 Levels of Listening podcast series? Would it be the 4 Villains of Listening? Or would it be somebody that I've interviewed? I'd love to hear from you. I can see from the downloads which speakers are resonating with you. But what I've found also is that's really been a function of the ones I've been promoting on social media. When I get to speak to people, they tell me consistently that there's always a specific episode that they feel is their favorite. Please send me an email, podcast@oscartrimboli.com. Let me know your favorite podcast and why. I'd love to know what it is about that podcast that you particularly enjoyed. What is it about that episode that you enjoyed? Here's an email from Alex in Cologne from Germany. Oscar, I wondered whether you'd had some time for some reflection on a topic that occurred for me recently. During a workshop, we were exploring the 5 levels of listening, and on an individual and team level, everything was great. We had a great reflection, and then there was a moment of despair when someone in the room said, "Talking time is power. We can't break that up. It's our culture." Do you have any ideas on what to do? I'd love to hear from you. Best wishes, Alex. This message is from Dana in Vancouver in Canada. I hope you and yours are healthy, safe, and well during the pandemic. Thank you so much for the deep listening impact beyond words playing cards. At this time, I'm using the cards for myself, and I made reading the book a morning habit. I have the cards set up on my desk for a week, and for that week, I practiced just that skill and that concept. I was first introduced to your work when you were on the Art of Charm podcast, 5 Hacks to Improve Your Listening. This came at a pivotal time in my life when I needed to learn to listen beyond the words being spoken. Oscar, when I took the quiz, I learned that I'm a shrewd listener and a lost listener. One of my experiences that identified being the shrewd listener, it doesn't facilitate great connectedness or create a safe place, a place of openness, so that my partner feels he's always being fixed, or a science experiment. Learning this of myself, I started to ask more questions. Identifying as a lost listener, one of the most helpful practices that I started is the focus on my own breath. I could go on and on and on about what I'm learning, but I'll leave it with this. When I listen to myself during the conversation, I can identify when my emotions are being flooded, and then I need to reset and bring myself back online. I'm stoked to be on this journey. My appreciation is beyond words. Dana. Tracy, Sydney, Gary, Alex, and Dana. I'll be answering your questions on the regular Ask Me Anything episode. If you would like your question or your questions to be answered, simply email podcast@oscartrimboli.com. That's podcast@oscartrimboli.com with your most frustrating listening questions. Thanks for listening this far in. As a little reward and a thank you at the end of this episode, just a reminder, Eric deconstructs my voice during the interview. It's well worth listening. I'm Oscar Trimboli, and I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world, and you've given me the greatest gift of all. You've listened to me. Thanks for listening. So, Eric, what did you notice about my voice?
I noticed that your voice is very clear and very focused. I think in your articulation is excellent. So I think your coordination is really good. I would love to have you explore your range. I'm so curious. If normally what I would do if I was with you for a first session, we would do a siren, which is like a ah. Have you ever tried anything like that before?
No, but I'm really conscious to go the other way. And what I find the audience really enjoys sometimes
Yeah.
is when I come in closer, just speak in a whisper.
That's very powerful to actually encourage students to do that a lot.
Well,
Actually,
what do you
yeah.
think the contrast is there when you do that? Do you think you draw attention in by using the whisper?
Actually, I do. And it's funny. I have a student who's a Broadway singer, and she kept auditioning for roles and she wasn't landing anything. And she has a very powerful voice and like a very like a Jennifer, it's not Jennifer Hudson, but very Jennifer Hudson-esque and very powerful. And I finally had her, there's a song, and I am telling you I'm not, it's very big, right?
Mm.
But she didn't understand why she wasn't getting it. So we tried something different where I had her start the song with, and I am telling you, I'm not going. You're the best man I ever. And she got the role. And the director said, no one approached it that way. I think there's something that invites people to listening closer. And I think there's also something vulnerable about it. And people are, like I said, they're definitely afraid of being vulnerable themselves, but oh, it's so attractive in other people. People are willing to do it. And so they don't want to do it themselves. They're terrified, typically. But I think that's one of your vocal superpowers is that tone. I think it's really effective. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I felt some positive feedback. It's really easy to get into a mode when I'm explaining this where someone's eyes kind of glaze over and they tune out, especially when you're getting into the technical aspects. But I really felt like you were fully attentive the whole time, which was very calming.